The millionaire brother who stole the family fortune, and the quiet bookkeeper who quietly reconstructed the lie, cent by cent. Hey everyone, it's Ray. Welcome back to the channel. Before we get started, go ahead and settle in. Pour yourself a coffee, get comfortable, find your spot. This is a long one, and you're going to want to be cozy for it. Because tonight's story begins at the saddest place a family can gather.
A memorial, a room full of grief. And right in the midst of all that heavy sorrow, a man in an expensive suit does something so cold, so heartless, that the whole room forgets how to breathe. He humiliates his own brother. He throws him out of their dead mother's house in front of the entire family. What that sharp-dressed man doesn't know is that his quiet, beaten-down brother has spent 2 years building something.
Something patient. Something hidden deep within the numbers. So stay with me. Let's begin. The memorial was held at the old Brennan house on Hawthorne Lane. It was a gray afternoon in late autumn, the kind where the sky can't decide whether to rain. Cars lined the narrow street, all the way down to the corner.
Rain watched on a lunch later. My mother called 2 days later. My mother called me screed the house. The rooms were full of people in dark clothes. The food no one really wanted to eat. Speaking of won't careful ways people use render then.
She had lived in that house for nearly 60 years, raised her 2 sons in it, buried her husband from it, and she had died in the back bedroom with the window that looked out on the maple tree her husband planted the year they moved in.
The house was still full of her memory, with her needlepoint hanging on the walls, her chipped teacup sitting in the cabinet, and the smell of her, somehow, still lingering in the curtains. Thomas Brennan stood near the kitchen doorway, where he had always stood at family gatherings, a little to the side, a little out of the way.
He was 58 years old, tall and slightly stooped. With tired eyes and gray hair, he cut himself to save money. He wore the same dark suit he had worn to his father's funeral 9 years before. It was a little tight now across the shoulders. He had not bought a new one. He never bought anything for himself if he could help it. People came up to him, one by one, and took his hand.
Your mother was a wonderful woman, Tom. She's at peace now, Tom. You took such good care of her. That last one was true. Thomas had taken care of her.
For the last 2 years of her life, as the cancer took her piece by piece, it was Thomas who drove her to every appointment, Thomas who slept upright in the harsh vinyl chair by her hospital bed, and Thomas who learned to change her dressings and manage the medications in the quiet hours of the night. He had cut back his hours at work to do it. He had drained most of his savings to cover what the insurance didn't.
His younger brother, Ryan, had not done any of that. Ryan Brennan stood in the center of the living room, holding court, untouched by the years that had weighed so heavily on Thomas. Ryan was 45, tanned, fit, with a suit that fit him perfectly because it had been made too.
He had a gold watch and a confident laugh and a way of putting his hand on a grieving relative's shoulder that made it look like he was the one comforting them, when really he was the one being comforted. Ryan was the success of the family. Ryan ran Meridian Holdings, an investment firm with offices downtown and a name that sounded important.
Ryan had a big house across the city and a son named Ethan, a 16-year-old who looked like a ghost haunting his own family's wealth. For their whole lives, that had been the arrangement. Ryan was the bright one. The charming one. The one who was going somewhere. And Thomas was the other one. He was the family's silent anchor.
The brother who chose to stay behind, quietly absorbing the costs that no one else wanted to face. Thomas had made his peace with it. Mostly, a man can carry a thing a long way if he just decides not to look at how heavy it is. But that afternoon, something happened that Thomas would not be able to carry. There was a local reporter at the memorial. That was the strange part.
Ryan had become, in his own mind, a man of some importance in the city, and he had let it be known that the matriarch of the Brennan family had passed, and a reporter from the regional business paper had come to pay respects and, perhaps, to write a few warm lines about the prominent Mr. Ryan Brennan and his late mother. So when Ryan tapped his glass with a spoon, the same way you'd do at a wedding, and the room fell quiet, there was a camera in the room. Friends. Family. Thank you all for coming, Ryan said, and his voice was smooth and warm. My mother would have loved seeing this house so full. A murmur of agreement. I want to take a moment, Ryan went on, to talk about the future.
Because Mom would have wanted us to look forward, not back. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, heavy cream-colored paper. Before she passed, my mother made her wishes very clear. She put them in writing. And I think, out of respect for her, we should all know what she wanted. Thomas felt something cold move through him.
My mother's will, Ryan said, holding up the paper, leaves the family home, this house, to me, in full. He let that sit for a moment. She knew I'd take care of it. She knew I had the means to preserve it, to keep it in the family the way it should be. The room had gone very still, and then Ryan turned, slowly, and looked at his brother.
Tom, he said, and his voice took on a note of false gentleness that was somehow worse than cruelty. I know you've been staying here since Mom got sick, and I appreciate everything you did. I do. But the house is mine now. And honestly, it's time. I've got people coming to look at it next week. So I'm going to need you to have your things out by the end of the month. You could have heard a pin drop.
Only my mother, the total leaking left stood and left her on the way. 2 days later, replied in logical way, screaming because 30. Thomas stood in the kitchen doorway in his too-tight suit in front of 4 members of the family in front of her and poured him his nephew the house when he had slept in a care beside her for 2 years.
He was being evicted from it, at her memorial, by his own brother, in front of everyone. Ryan, an aunt said weakly. Surely this isn't the time. It's exactly the time, Ryan said pleasantly. Mom's gone. The estate has to be settled. I'm just being honest about it. He smiled at the room. Tom understands. Don't you, Tom? 40 faces waited to see Thomas Brennan crumble.
And here is the thing you need to understand about Thomas. He did not crumble. He looked at his brother for a long moment. And then he nodded slowly, and he said, in a quiet, steady voice, end of the month. Sure, Ryan.
And he set down his paper plate, and he walked through the kitchen and out the back door, past the maple tree his father planted, and he got into his old car and drove away while the whole family watched him go. He did not cry. He drove 3 blocks and he pulled over, and he reached into the back seat for a worn leather folder, thick with papers, that he had been carrying with him everywhere for almost a year now.
He set it on the passenger seat. He rested his hand on it for a moment. Then he took out his phone and made a call. Diane, he said. It's Tom Brennan. He did it. He read the will out loud, in front of everyone. He's claiming the whole house. He listened for a moment. Then, for the first time all day, something flickered across his tired face. It was not quite a smile. It was something steadier than a smile.
Yes, he said. I think it's time. Let's set the meeting. Okay, I have to stop right there, because did you catch that? The folder. The phone call. Let's set the meeting. This man did not break. He has a plan. And to understand the plan, you have to understand Thomas Brennan, and what it does to a person to be the one who stays. Let's go back.
To understand Thomas, you have to understand the family he was born into, and the role he was handed before he was old enough to refuse it. The Brennans were not wealthy people. Their father, Walter, was a foreman at a tool and die plant, a big, quiet man with enormous hands who lived by a simple creed: a man is measured by the weight of his actions, never the polish of his words.
He bought the house on Hawthorne Lane the year Thomas was born, and he planted a maple tree in the front yard, and he told his wife they would grow old in that house. He was right about one of them. Eleanor was the warmth of the family.
She kept the books for the household down to the penny, in a series of black ledgers she stored in the kitchen drawer, and she had a saying she repeated so often that both her sons could recite it in their sleep. "The books always balance in the end," she would say, licking the tip of her pencil. "Every kindness is an entry. Every cruelty, too. It all gets recorded."
It just takes longer than you'd like for the columns to add up. Thomas was the older son, and from the beginning he was Walter's boy. Steady, careful, good with numbers like his mother. He was the one who mowed the lawn without being asked, who got the after-school job, who handed his paycheck to his mother to help with the bills.
When their father got sick, years later, it was Thomas who took the night shifts at the hospital. When their father died, it was Thomas who handled the arrangements, who paid for what the insurance didn't cover, who sat with his mother in the empty house afterward. Ryan was the younger son, and from the beginning he was something else entirely. Bright, quick, charming, restless.
He could talk his way out of any trouble and into any room. He was the one who got the attention, because he demanded it, and because he was so good at being charming that people forgave him things they would never forgive anyone else. The brothers loved each other once. You should know that. It wasn't always like it became.
When they were boys, Thomas taught Ryan to ride a bike, running behind him down Hawthorne Lane with his hand on the seat, letting go without telling him. There's a photograph somewhere of the two of them on the back steps. Thomas may be 10 and Ryan may be 4, and Thomas has his arm around his little brother, and they are both laughing at something that is gone now and will never be remembered.
There's another memory, too, one Thomas kept folded away and rarely took out, because it hurt to look at. They were teenagers. Their father had just lost his job when the plant cut a shift, and the house was full of a quiet, grinding fear that the boys could feel even if they didn't understand it. And Ryan, 15 and already golden, had come home one afternoon and emptied a paper bag onto the kitchen table.
$42. He'd talked his way into a weekend job no one his age should have gotten, lied about his experience, charmed the manager, and he'd done it, he told Thomas privately, so Mom wouldn't cry at night anymore. He'd heard her through the wall. He couldn't stand it. That was the thing nobody understood about Ryan, the thing that made what he became so much sadder. He had not started out cold.
Only my brother told he can watch in the lighters to drive her car. Understood her plan and walked away. 2 days later, my mother called me screaming because 30, he had started out as a boy who couldn't stand to his mother cry. Somewhere between that kitchen table and the pie of the charm, and of course stopped seeing the boy and Brennan big inside the man with the gold watch.
It would have been so much easier to hate Ryan if Thomas could have forgotten him. He never could. That was the whole tragedy of it, really. He never could. But somewhere along the way, the arrangement hardened into something permanent. Thomas became the one who gave. Ryan became the one who took it. And the family, without ever quite deciding to, agreed that this was simply the natural order of things.
Thomas would handle the burdens. Ryan would handle the glory. Ryan went into finance. He was good at it, in the way that charming people are good at convincing other people to hand over their money. He started Meridian Holdings, and he drove nicer and nicer cars, and at every family gathering he was the centerpiece, telling stories about deals and clients and the big life he was building.
And Thomas would stand a little to the side, in the kitchen doorway, listening and quietly pick up the check when it came. Thomas had built a quieter life, a modest house, a marriage that had ended gently years ago, leaving him alone but not bitter. A grown daughter, Hannah, who lived 2 hours away and called him every Sunday.
And a profession that almost no one in the family fully understood, because Thomas never talked about himself. Thomas was a forensic accountant. For 30 years, that had been his work. He was the man that banks and law firms and federal investigators called when money had gone somewhere it wasn't supposed to go.
He could take a tangle of accounts, shell companies, and wire transfers, and follow the thread through all of it, patiently, one number at a time, until he found the truth hiding at the center. He had testified in fraud trials. He had unwound Ponzi schemes. He had spent his career learning a single, quiet skill. He could read the story that money tells. And money, unlike people, cannot lie. It can only hide.
And Thomas Brennan was very, very good at finding what money was hiding. There was a case, years back, that the federal investigators he worked with still talked about. A charity that had raised millions for sick children, run by a beloved local figure, beyond suspicion, adored by the whole community. Every other investigator had looked at the books and found them clean.
Thomas looked at the same books for a week and found a single recurring expense, a maintenance contract for a building the charity didn't own, paid to a company that didn't exist, that drained a few $1,000s every single month into the pocket of the beloved local figure. It was tiny. It was buried under millions of honest dollars. Everyone else had walked right past it.
Thomas had found it because he didn't read the numbers the way other people did. He read them the way you'd read a face, looking for the one expression that didn't belong. That was his gift. The same gift his mother had, hunched over her black ledgers at the kitchen table. The patience to look at a thing everyone else found boring, for as long as it took, until it told you the truth.
The family thought it made him dull. It was, in fact, one of the most formidable skills a human being can possess. It just happened to be quiet, and the quiet things never get the applause. His whole family thought of him as the one who stayed, the one who didn't amount to much. Ryan's boring older brother, the bookkeeper. They had no idea what he actually did for a living. They were about to find out.
Now I want to take you somewhere quiet and sad and important. Because the story everyone in that family believed, that Thomas was just a beaten-down caretaker, it missed what was really happening in that back bedroom during those long nights. Let me show you. The last 2 years of Eleanor Brennan's life were spent dying slowly, and it was Thomas who was there for all of it. He moved into the old house when the diagnosis came. He set up in his childhood bedroom and spent his days and most of his nights caring for his mother. The chemotherapy. The endless appointments. The slow, cruel arithmetic of a body failing.
Ryan visited occasionally, breezing through the door with expensive bouquets and a hollow, booming cheerfulness, staying just 40 minutes, taking a photo with Mom for his phone, and sweeping out again to somewhere more important. The actual work, the hard and humbling and holy work of caring for a dying parent, fell to Thomas. The way it always had. He did not resent it. That's important.
He loved his mother, and the time with her, even in its sorrow, was a gift he would never regret. But here is where the story turns. Eleanor Brennan had always kept her own finances. Even into her 70s, she did her own books, in her own ledgers, the way she had her whole life. But as the illness took her strength, she could no longer manage it. And so, one evening, she asked her older son to help her.
Tommy, you've always had a head for numbers. Sit with me. So Thomas sat with her, by the lamp, and he opened her accounts. And almost immediately, something was wrong. Her savings, the money she and Walter had carefully set aside over 50 years, was mostly gone. In its place were statements from something called the Meridian Family Income Fund.
Coley, you can watch it on the live stream from your car. Understood, I replied and walked away. 2D screaming because 30 years later, my mother called me screaming. You're starting over the past few years, transferred Neil for savings and grow more SEDEX statements, showed it grow lines and has products made the statements for a long time. Real markets are jagged.
These statements were not jagged. They were beautiful. And in Thomas's long experience, beautiful, smooth, two good returns were the single most common signature of a particular kind of lie. He didn't say anything to his mother. Not then. He didn't want to frighten her, or to be wrong, or to start a war over her hospital bed.
But that night, after she fell asleep, Thomas sat by the lamp in the quiet house, and he began, very quietly, to pull a thread. He still had access to the tools of his profession. He still had the eye. And over the following weeks and months, in the small hours of the night while his mother slept, while the machines beeped softly and the maple tree scratched at the window, Thomas Brennan began to do what he did best.
He followed the money. He started with his mother's statements and traced the Meridian Family Income Fund. He found that the fund did not invest in much of anything. The money that came in from people like his mother did not go into stocks or bonds or real estate. It went into other accounts.
And from those accounts it was used to pay returns to earlier investors, and to fund Ryan's lifestyle, the cars and the house and the suits, and to disappear into a maze of shell companies with names like Meridian Strategic and Halewood Partners and Brennan Legacy LLC. It was a Ponzi scheme. Classic one.
Ryan was taking money from new investors, many of them family friends, neighbors, people from the old neighborhood who trusted the Brennan name, and using it to pay fake returns to older investors and to fund his own life. As long as new money kept coming in, the lie held up. The moment it stopped, the whole thing would collapse, and everyone who had trusted him would be ruined. Including his own mother.
That was the part that took Thomas a moment to absorb fully, sitting there in the lamplight. It was one thing to find a fraud. He had found dozens of them. It was another thing entirely to find his own mother's name among the victims, her life savings, the money she and his father had set aside dollar by careful dollar over 50 years, fed into his brother's machine and burned.
Eleanor Brennan had handed her son her trust, and her money, and the savings of half the neighborhood she'd sent his way, and he had taken all of it and shown her a beautiful fake statement every month and let her be proud of him.
Thomas looked over at her, asleep in the hospital bed, her chest rising and falling, the woman who had taught him that the books always balance, who had no idea that her own beautiful boy had spent her down to nothing while she was dying. He thought he might be sick.
Then the feeling passed, and in its place came something cold and clear and permanent, the feeling of a man who has just understood, with total certainty, what he is going to spend the next 2 years of his life doing, and why. Thomas sat in the lamplight with this knowledge, and he felt something he had not felt in many years. Not sadness. He was used to sadness. This was colder than sadness, and clearer.
His little brother, the boy he had taught to ride a bike, was stealing from their dying mother. He was stealing from the whole family. He was building his shining life on the savings of people who had known them since they were children. Thomas closed the laptop. He looked over at his mother, so small now under the blankets, her hands folded on her chest the way they had been folded in prayer 10,000 times.
And Thomas made a decision. He would not confront Ryan. Not yet. Confrontations were loud, and the loud ones always won the room, and Ryan would talk his way out of it the way he talked his way out of everything. No. Thomas would do what he had done his whole career. He would be patient. He would gather. He would document.
He would build a case so complete, so airtight, so undeniable, that not even Ryan's golden tongue could talk his way out of it. He would let the numbers do what numbers do. He would let the books balance. Now, doing this kind of work in secret, in your dying mother's house, with the very man you're investigating dropping by whenever he feels like it, that is nerve-wracking. And one night, it almost all came apart.
Let me take you behind the curtain for a second. It was dangerous work, what Thomas was doing, and not because it was illegal. It wasn't. He had every right to help his mother with her own accounts, and a forensic accountant studying public filings and following a money trail breaks no law. The danger was simpler and more human than that.
If Ryan found out what Thomas was doing before the case was complete, Ryan would run. Or worse, he would start destroying records, moving money, covering his tracks. A half-built case is a warning, not a trap. And so Thomas worked the way he'd learned to work over 30 years. Quietly, carefully, leaving no trace of what he was really doing. But Ryan came to the house sometimes, unannounced.
Coldly, you watched on the live, stood our car, understood, I replied, and walked away. 2 days later, my mother called me screaming, business within the front door with expensive booth and steady bozo chair, putting on a brief performance of an exemplar of vanish and her statement spread across the table in neat piles.
Thomas heard the front door, heard his brother's voice calling out, and he had perhaps 4 seconds. He did not panic. Thomas had never panicked in his life. It was one of the things people mistook for dullness.
He simply closed the laptop and swept the statements into a folder, and by the time Ryan walked into the kitchen, Thomas looked exactly like the man they all believed him to be, a dull, harmless bookkeeper, the caretaker lost in his mother's little household accounts. "Hey, Tom," Ryan said, glancing at the table. "What's all this?" "Mom's bills," Thomas said, not looking up. "Utilities. The pharmacy."
"I'm keeping her household running while she's sick. Somebody has to." Ryan's eyes lingered on the folder for a moment. Just a moment. "You and your numbers," he said, and there was something in his voice, a flicker of unease quickly covered. "You know, you don't have to do all that by hand. I could have my people at Meridian handle Mom's finances. We're set up for it. Save you the trouble." And there it was.
The offer to take control. The wolf gently suggesting he guard the sheep. Thomas felt his pulse in his throat, but his face gave away nothing. He had spent a career keeping his face still in rooms full of people who would have loved to know what he was thinking. "That's kind of you," he said mildly. "But you've got enough on your plate running an empire. I don't mind. It's just busy work."
Keep my hands occupied while I sit with her. Ryan studied him for one more second. Then the charm came back, smooth as oil, and he laughed and clapped his brother on the shoulder. "Suit yourself. Always the martyr, huh, Tom?" And he went in to spend his usual brisk half-hour with their mother. Thomas sat very still until he heard Ryan's voice in the other room. Then he let out a slow breath. It had been close.
Closer than he liked. If Ryan had asked to see what was in the folder, if he had pushed even a little, Thomas wasn't sure the moment would have held. After that night, Thomas changed how he worked. He stopped bringing anything to the house. He did the real work at his own home, late at night, and kept nothing at Hawthorne Lane but a single sheet of innocent household sums, in case Ryan came by. It was a splinter.
Small, sharp, a warning. You pull it out, and you're more careful from then on. And Thomas was. From that night until the day the trap closed, he never gave his brother another reason to look twice. His mother, drifting in and out of sleep in the next room, never knew how close her 2 sons had come, that night, to the collision that was already, quietly, on its way. "Hey, it's Ray."
So Thomas knows his brother is running a scam. But there's another piece to this, and it's the piece that breaks my heart a little. Because their mother, Eleanor, wasn't a fool. And what she did in her final weeks tells you she knew more than anyone realized. Listen to this. As the months passed and Eleanor grew weaker, something began to weigh on her. Thomas could see it.
A worry behind her eyes that had nothing to do with the cancer. One night, near the end, when the pain medication had worn off and she was lucid and quiet, she took her older son's hand. "Tommy," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen, because I won't have the strength to say it twice." "I'm listening, Mom. I'm not as foolish as your brother thinks I am," she said.
Her voice was thin but steady. I see things. A mother sees things. I've watched the money I gave Ryan, and I've watched the friends I sent to him, the Hendersons, poor Mrs. Calloway down the street, and I've started to wonder where it's all really going. The statements are very pretty, Tommy. Maybe too pretty. You'd know better than I would. Thomas said nothing. He didn't have to. She saw the answer in his face. That's what I thought, Eleanor said softly, and she closed her eyes for a moment. My boy. My beautiful boy. What did he turn into? They sat in silence for a while. I can't fix what he's done, she said finally. I don't have the strength, and I don't have the time, and God help me, I can't be the one to send my own son to prison. I'm his mother.
I'll be gone soon, and I'll have to leave that to others. She opened her eyes and looked at Thomas. But I can do one thing. I can make sure he doesn't get this house. She told him then about the will.
There was a will Ryan knew about, an old one, from years ago, that left things split between the boys, with the house going to whoever could best look after it, language vague enough that a man like Ryan could twist it. But Eleanor had made a new one, quietly.
She had asked a neighbor to drive her to a lawyer's office downtown, a lawyer named Diane Kessler whose name she had gotten, she said, from a card Thomas had once left on the kitchen counter without thinking. A forensic accountant knows good attorneys. Eleanor had remembered. The new will was clear and clean, and notarized and witnessed.
You can bother told you can finish to watch it on the live stream from your car. Understood. I replied and walked away 2 days later. Mother called me screaming because the 30 left the house on Hawthorne Lane to Thomas in recognition of trust for her grandson and rise boy. But Tom always trusted you. I just never said it or ever needed to hear it the way your brother did.
That was my mistake, Tommy. One of many. Her eyes were wet. I let the world tell you that the one who stays is worth less than the one who shines. And that was a lie. The one who stays is worth everything. You were worth everything, and I should have told you every day. Thomas could not speak. The will is with Diane Kessler, Eleanor said. And Tommy, listen. Your brother will fight it. He'll lie.
He may even try to make a false one of his own. He's capable of it now, I think. God forgive me for knowing that about my own child. She gripped his hand with what strength she had left. Whatever he does, you let the truth come out. Not for revenge. I don't want you eaten up with revenge, it'll hollow you out. You let it come out because it's true. Because the books have to balance. Promise me.
I promise, Thomas said. Eleanor Brennan died 11 days later, in the back bedroom, with her older son holding her hand and the maple tree scratching softly at the window. And she was right about everything. Because at her memorial, 3 weeks later, Ryan stood up in front of the whole family and read a will that left him the house. A will that Eleanor Brennan had never signed.
So now you understand what really happened in that living room. When Ryan held up that will and threw his brother out, he wasn't just being cruel. He was committing a crime. And he had no idea that the one person in that room who could prove it was the brother he was humiliating. Let's keep going. The day after the memorial, Thomas sat in the downtown office of Diane Kessler.
Diane was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and precise, an estate and litigation attorney who did not waste words. She had liked Eleanor Brennan immensely, and she did not like what had happened at that memorial one bit. "Let me make sure I understand," Diane said. "Your brother stood up at your mother's memorial and read a will leaving him the house." "Yes. And we are holding your mother's actual will."
Signed in this office. Witnessed by 2 members of my staff. Notarized. Leaving the house to you, a protected trust to the grandson, and naming you executor. Yes. Diane folded her hands. Then your brother has a problem, Thomas. Because one of those 2 documents is a forgery. And it isn't ours. Thomas nodded slowly. I'd like to be certain, Before we do anything,
I'd like an expert to examine his document and confirm it's fake. I want this airtight. You sound like a man who's done this before. I've done it for other people, Thomas said. For 30 years. I never thought I'd be doing it for my own family. Getting a look at Ryan's version of the will was not difficult.
As the named executor under the real will, and through the proper legal channels, Diane was entitled to demand that any competing testamentary document be produced and lodged with the probate court. Ryan, arrogant and certain, filed his forged will with the court himself, never imagining there was another one waiting. He thought he was claiming his inheritance. He was actually handing the prosecution its evidence.
Diane brought in a forensic document examiner named Dr. Sandra Pierce. She had 30 years of experience and a reputation as one of the best in the country. She examined Ryan's document beside genuine samples of Eleanor's signature, dozens of them, gathered from old checks, letters, and the real will itself. It did not take her long. The signature on your brother's document is a forgery, Dr.
Pierce told them, laying the two side by side under a bright lamp. And not a particularly good one, frankly, though good enough to fool someone who wasn't looking carefully. She pointed with a pencil. Here. Your mother's real signature. See the pressure, light and even, the way the pen flows without stopping. That's a hand that signed its own name for 60 years. It doesn't think about it.
It just moves. She slid the pencil to the forged version. Now here. See the tremor? The tiny hesitations? The places where the line is too heavy, where the pen pressed down while someone concentrated. This wasn't signed. It was drawn. Someone studied your mother's signature and copied it, slowly, line by line. She straightened. Whoever made this practice. But they could not practice 60 years of muscle memory.
You cannot fake that. It's a forgery. I'd testify to it anywhere. Thomas looked at the two signatures. He thought about his brother sitting somewhere, late at night, with their dead mother's signature in front of him, tracing it over and over, getting it wrong, getting it better, practicing his mother's name so he could steal her house. Something in Thomas hardened into its final shape, then.
There's more, he said quietly to Diane. The will is only part of it. There's the fund, the Meridian Family Income Fund. I want to show you what my brother's really been doing. Because the forged will, that's bad. But it isn't the thing that's going to bring him down. He opened the worn leather folder he carried everywhere, the one he'd had on the passenger seat the day of the memorial.
He laid it on Diane's desk, and he began in his quiet, patient voice to walk her through 2 years of work. The shell companies, the fake returns, the money from neighbors and family friends, the Ponzi structure underneath the shining surface of Meridian Holdings. Diane Kessler listened, and as she listened, her face changed from professional concern to something closer to alarm.
And your Connor stood, I replied, John Lodge stood, I replied, and walked away. 2 days later, my mother called me screaming. This isn't a stain dispute and finished. These are securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. Thomas said, I'm holding, Thomas said.
The question was never whether I could bring it to the authorities. Then what was the question? Thomas was quiet for a moment. When, he said. And how? And in front of whom? Quick pause. I just want to say, if you've ever been the one in the family who does all the work and gets none of the credit, the one people overlook, the one who quietly holds it all together, this story is for you.
Because Thomas is about to show every single one of those people what patience can do. Stick with me. You might be wondering why Thomas waited. He had proof of a forged will. He had proof of a massive financial fraud. He could have walked into an FBI field office the morning after the memorial and handed it all over and let the machinery of justice grind his brother into dust. Why hold back?
Part of it was professional. Thomas had spent 30 years watching fraud cases fall apart because someone moved too soon, before the evidence was complete, before every account was traced, before the trap was fully built. He knew that a man like Ryan, charming and quick and well-lawyered, could slip through a weak case like water through fingers. Thomas was not going to give him that chance.
He was going to make the case so complete that there was no escape, no clever explanation, no reasonable doubt. He was a craftsman, and he would not hand over an unfinished thing. But part of it, if he was honest with himself in the dark hours, was something else. His mother had asked him not to do it for revenge. And he had promised. And he meant to keep that promise.
But Thomas was a human being, and his brother had spent a lifetime treating him like he was nothing, and had then humiliated him at their mother's memorial, in front of the whole family, in front of a reporter, and had tried to throw him out of the house where he had watched their mother die. A man can forgive a great deal. But he is also allowed, perhaps, to want the truth to come out in a way that is seen.
Not for cruelty. For balance. For the record. So that everyone who watched Thomas walk out of that living room with his head down would one day understand exactly what they had witnessed. His mother had said it herself. The books always balance. Every kindness is an entry. Every cruelty, too. Thomas was an accountant. He believed in balanced books with his whole soul.
So he made his plan, and the plan had a shape to it, like a good audit. It would happen in stages. First, he would complete the financial case, every last account, so that when it landed with the full weight of 2 years of patient work.
Second, he would coordinate with the authorities, quietly, so that when the moment came, they would be ready to act, not in some distant future, but immediately, in the room. And third, the will. The forged will would be the doorway. Because the estate had to be settled in front of the family, and Ryan, in his arrogance, had already set the stage by filing his forgery with the court. There would be a formal reading.
A gathering. And Thomas would make sure that the gathering became the place where everything came out in the right order in front of the right people. He went to see a man he had worked with for years, a federal agent named Marsh who ran financial crimes investigations. Thomas had helped Marsh's team on 3 cases over the past decade. Marsh trusted Thomas the way you trust a surgeon's hands.
Thomas laid the folder on Marsh's desk and said, simply, I need you to look at something. And I need you to understand that it's my brother. Agent Marsh read for a long time. When he finished, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Tom, he said. I've known you for 15 years. You've never brought me a case that wasn't exactly what you said it was. So I have to ask. Are you sure you want to be the one who does this? To your own brother? Because once I open this, it doesn't close. There's no taking it back. Thomas looked out the window for a moment. He stole from our mother, he said. On her deathbed. He stole from the Hendersons, who used to babysit us. From Mrs. Calloway, who brought a casserole to every funeral this family ever had.
He's going to keep stealing until it collapses, and when it collapses, all those people lose everything, and he flies somewhere with no extradition. He turned back to Marsh. I'm not doing this because he humiliated me. I could have lived with that. I've lived with worse my whole life. I'm doing it because somebody has to stop him, and I'm the only one who can see how.
Marsh nodded slowly, and put his glasses back on. All right, he said. Then let's do it right. Walk me through every account. From the beginning. And Thomas did. Patiently. One number at a time. The way he did everything. I want to slow down for a second, because there's a part of this story that isn't about Thomas or Ryan at all. It's about the people in the middle.
The ones who trusted the wrong man with everything they had. And one afternoon, Thomas went to see one of them. This scene is the reason he couldn't walk away. There was an afternoon, while the case was still being built, when Thomas drove back to the old neighborhood and parked outside a small white house 3 doors down from Hawthorne Lane. Mrs. Calloway lived there. She was 83.
Only my mother told me watch it on live stream from your car. Understood. I'm there from car. Understood. My mom walked away 2 days later. My mother called me screaming because the 30 she had brought a casserole to Brennan house after the dad's after their death and trouble the family that gonna ones to turn us way that good neighbors love the children on their street.
And she had given Ryan everything she had. Thomas knocked. She was delighted to see him, fussed him into the kitchen, made tea with hands that shook slightly. They talked about his mother, and she cried a little, and so did he. And then, because he needed to know, because he needed to be sure of what he was about to do, he asked her, gently, about her finances. Her face lit up.
"Oh, I'm in wonderful shape, thanks to your brother," she said. "Ryan's been managing my Harold's life insurance. Every penny of it. The statements come every month, and it's just growing and growing. He says when I pass, there'll be enough to leave something real to my grandchildren. Imagine that. Old Edith Calloway, leaving something behind." She patted Thomas's hand. "Your brother is a good man, Thomas.
You should be so proud of him. I know your mother was." Thomas looked at this kind old woman, who had brought casseroles to his family's worst days, who was so proud, so happy, so certain that her dead husband's money was safe and growing in the care of the charming boy she'd watched grow up. And he knew that it was gone. All of it. Spent on suits and cars and a watch.
The statements she treasured were beautiful lies. The money she planned to leave her grandchildren did not exist and never had. He could not tell her. Not yet. Telling her now, before the case was complete, would only frighten her and warn Ryan. So he sat in her kitchen and drank her tea and let her believe, for a little while longer, that the world was as kind as she was.
But he drove home that afternoon with his jaw set, and any last shred of doubt about what he was doing burned away on the drive. He had told himself, in his lowest moments, that perhaps this was partly about his own pride. The memorial. The humiliation. Perhaps he was just a wounded man dressing up his revenge as justice. Mrs. Calloway's porch ended that argument forever. This was not about Thomas's pride.
This was about an 83-year-old widow who was going to die believing she'd left her grandchildren a gift, when in truth a charming man had stolen it while she made him tea. There were dozens like her. The Hendersons. Families from the old neighborhood. People who had trusted the Brennan name. Somebody had to stand up for them.
And the only person in the world who could see the whole truth, who had the skill to prove it, who could follow the money all the way down to the bottom, was the quiet older brother that everyone had spent 50 years overlooking. So he would. Not for the memorial. Not for the house. For Mrs.
Calloway's porch, and the casseroles, and the lemonade on hot summer days, and every kindness she had ever entered into the great ledger that his mother believed always, in the end, balanced. Now here's where it gets even bigger. Because Thomas wasn't the only one who'd figured out that Ryan's empire was a house of cards. Somebody on the inside knew too. And that somebody was about to become very, very important.
Are you still with me? Drop a comment. Let me know where you're watching from tonight. I love seeing this community. Okay, back to it. As Agent Marsh's team began their quiet work, a name kept surfacing in the records. Kevin Doyle. Kevin Doyle was the chief financial officer of Meridian Holdings. He was the numbers man, the one who actually moved the money while Ryan charmed the clients.
If Ryan was the face of the fraud, Kevin Doyle was the hands. His fingerprints, in the form of authorizations and signatures and transfers, were all over the shell companies. But as Thomas studied the records more closely, he noticed something interesting. Something that did not fit. In the last 6 months, the pattern of the money had changed slightly.
Small amounts had begun to move in ways that didn't match the rest of the scheme. Someone was creating a careful paper trail. Someone was, in effect, building a record of their own, documenting what was happening, almost as if they were preparing a defense. Or preparing to cooperate. "He knows it's coming," Thomas told Agent Marsh. "Doyle. Look at this. He's not just moving the money anymore. He's protecting himself."
He's seen schemes like this collapse before. He knows how it ends. He's getting ready to jump. Marsh studied the records and nodded. "You think he'd flip?" "I think," Thomas said, "that Kevin Doyle is a man who has spent years being the one who does the dirty work while Ryan takes the glory and the spotlight." A thin, tired smile. "I know the type," Thomas told Agent Marsh.
When the walls close in, men like Doyle start weaponizing years of accumulated slights. They don't destroy the empire out of justice. They do it because they're finally tired of being invisible. Marsh's team approached Kevin Doyle quietly. It did not take much. Thomas had read him exactly right.
Doyle had seen the end coming for months, and he was terrified, and underneath the terror was a deep, simmering resentment at Ryan Brennan, who had used him, underpaid him relative to the risk, blamed him when things went wrong, and never once let him stand in the light. When the federal agents laid out what they had, and offered him a path that did not end in a maximum security prison, Kevin Doyle took it.
So did my mother turn the live stream from your car? Understood, I replied, and walked away. 2 days later, my mother called me screaming because at 30, he became the government's cooperating witness. He handed over everything. Impertinent communications, the real or 20 words, even the best defense attorney cannot wave away.
It was, Marsh told Thomas, the strongest financial fraud case he'd built in years. Much of that strength came from the nights Thomas spent in the federal building with Marsh's team, long after the offices had emptied, the three of them hunched over screens and printouts with cold coffee going colder. Thomas would point at a transfer that looked, to everyone else, perfectly ordinary, and explain why it wasn't.
A payment routed through a company that did no business. A round number that appeared on the same day every month. A loan that was never meant to be repaid because the lender and the borrower were the same man wearing two hats. The young analysts on Marsh's team had been trained in the textbook version of this work.
Thomas had spent 30 years doing the real thing, and he could see the shape of a lie in a spreadsheet the way a sailor reads weather in the color of the sky. "How do you do that?" one of the young analysts asked him one night, watching him pull a hidden account out of a tangle of filings that the whole team had missed. "Money has a grammar," Thomas said, not looking up. "Honest money moves for reasons.
It pays for things, it earns things, it follows the logic of actual life. Dirty money moves to hide. Once you learn the difference, you stop reading the numbers and start reading the human intent behind them. After that, it's just patience." He made a small note in the margin. "And I have a great deal of patience. I've been practicing my whole life."
By the time they were finished, every dollar of the Meridian fraud had a name and a destination and a date. There were no gaps. There was nothing for a defense attorney to pry open. It was, as even Ryan's own lawyer would admit much later, the cleanest case he had ever lost. But there was one more twist that Thomas did not see coming, and it came from a direction he had not been watching. Sloane, Ryan's wife.
Thomas had always assumed Sloane was simply a beneficiary of Ryan's lifestyle, a woman who wore sunglasses indoors and didn't ask too many questions about where the money came from as long as it kept coming. He'd written her off. He was wrong about her, the way people are usually wrong about the quiet ones. He of all people should have known better.
Because Sloane Brennan, it turned out, had figured out years ago that her husband was a fraud. And she had made her own quiet preparations. She had been documenting Ryan's behavior, copying records, and, in the last year, quietly moving her own assets out of reach and consulting a divorce attorney. She was not loyal to Ryan.
She had simply been waiting, the way Thomas had been waiting, for the right moment to save herself and her son. When the investigation reached her, she did not protect her husband. She protected Ethan, her boy, and herself, and she handed over what she had.
Ryan Brennan, the charming one, the bright one. The one who took and never once imagined the people around him were keeping their own ledgers, was surrounded on every side and did not know it. His brother, his CFO, his wife, every person he had ever underestimated was quietly writing down what he had done. The books were balanced. We are getting close now. I can feel it.
If you're enjoying this story, do me a quick favor and tap that like button. It really does help the channel reach more people. And if you've made it this far with me, you're one of the real ones. Alright. Let's tighten the net. Over the following weeks, the case came together like a machine being assembled, piece by precise piece. Agent Marsh's team mapped every dollar. They traced the Meridian Family Income Fund through its maze of shell companies and out the other side. They documented the fake statements, the ones with the too smooth returns, the ones Ryan had been mailing to trusting old people like Eleanor Brennan for years. They built the timeline. They secured Kevin Doyle's cooperation and Sloane's records. They prepared the warrants.
And alongside the federal case, Diane Kessler prepared the estate case. The forged will. Dr. Pierce's report. The real will, signed and witnessed in her office, sitting safe in her files. The two cases were separate, legally. One was a criminal fraud matter handled by the federal government. The other was a probate matter handled in the civil courts.
But Thomas saw a way to bring them together, in a single room, in a single afternoon. Because the timing could be arranged. Here was the shape of it. There would be a formal proceeding to settle the dispute over the two wills. Ryan had filed his forged document. Diane would present the real one.
A meeting would be set at Diane's law office, with both brothers present, the relevant family members invited as interested parties, and a representative of the probate court in attendance. Ryan, certain of himself, certain that his charm and his lawyer and his version of events would carry the day, would walk in expecting to defend his claim to a house. He would not be walking into an estate dispute.
Calling mother told you can watch on the live stream from your car. Understood, I replied, and walked away 2 days later. Mother calling into a trap because the thermos had a wrench when it came to a trap because Thomas' original team would be ready to move on this step in, and the second fire heavy door would open tears.
Diane had described it back to Thomas to make sure she understood, and the way she said it, Thomas knew she finally understood the kind of man she was working with. The first tier destroys his reputation, she said. We expose the forged will in front of your whole family. Everyone who watched him humiliate you at that memorial watches him exposed as a man who forged his dead mother's signature.
That's the human reckoning. That's the part they'll never forget. Yes, Thomas said. And the second tier destroys his freedom. The moment that's done, the federal agents move. The fraud. The arrest. The frozen assets. That's the legal reckoning. Yes. Diane studied him for a moment. You know, most people in your position would just want the house back. They'd settle. Quietly. Get what's theirs and move on.
I'm not most people, Thomas said. And this was never about the house. The date was set. Everything was in place. The financial case. The cooperating witness. The forensic report. The real will. The federal team. The room. There was only one thing Thomas had not planned for. The night before the meeting, his phone rang. It was Ryan. Okay, picture this.
The night before everything comes crashing down, and the phone rings, and it's the brother. What do you even say? What does Thomas say? This part stuck with me. Let's listen. Thomas almost didn't answer. He stood in his small kitchen, looking at his brother's name on the screen, and he thought about letting it go to voicemail.
But some old thread that ran all the way back to a boy running behind a bicycle with his hand on the seat, made him pick up. "Tom," Ryan said, and his voice was warm, easy, the voice that had charmed 1,000 investors. "Hey. Listen. About this whole thing tomorrow. I've been thinking. I don't want us fighting. We're brothers. Mom would have hated this." Thomas said nothing.
"So here's what I'm thinking," Ryan went on. "Let's not drag the whole family through some ugly court thing, okay? You drop the dispute, let the estate go through the way Mom wanted, and I'll take care of you. I will. I'll cut you a check. A real one. 200,000. For everything you did, taking care of her. You earned it, Tom, I mean that. Let me do right by you. Brother to brother."
It was, Thomas had to admit, a good performance. The warmth. The flattery. The way Ryan made the bribe sound like a gift, made the theft sound like generosity, made Thomas feel, for just a second, like he'd be the unreasonable one for saying no. It was the same voice that had been lying to old people for years. "That's generous, Ryan," Thomas said quietly. "It's the right thing."
We're family. Ryan's voice relaxed, sensing victory. He always sensed victory, even when it wasn't there. "So we're good. You'll drop it?" Thomas looked out his kitchen window at the dark street. He thought about his mother's hand in his, 11 days before she died. "You let the truth come out. Not for revenge. Because it's true. Can I ask you something, Ryan?" "Sure, anything."
Do you remember teaching Ethan to ride a bike? There was a pause. The question wasn't what Ryan expected. What? Yeah, I guess. Why? "I taught you," Thomas said. "On Hawthorne Lane. I ran behind you with my hand on the seat, and I let go without telling you, and you rode half a block before you realized I wasn't holding on anymore. You were so happy.
You turned around and you yelled, 'Tommy, look, I'm doing it.'" Thomas's voice was steady, but something moved underneath it. "I think about that boy a lot, Ryan. I wonder where he went." The line was quiet. "What is this, Tom? Are you drunk? I'm offering you money." "I know you are," Thomas said. "And I want you to remember, tomorrow, that I told you no. Not because of the house. Not because of the money.
But because some things don't balance with a check." He paused. "Good night, Ryan. I'll see you tomorrow." He hung up before his brother could answer. He stood in the kitchen for a long time, in the dark, his heart heavy as a stone. There was no triumph in him. There was only the old grief, and underneath it, the terrible steadiness of a man who has made a promise to a dying woman and intends to keep it.
The boy on the bicycle was gone. He had been gone a long time. And tomorrow, the man he had become was going to learn what his quiet, overlooked, underestimated older brother had been doing in the lamplight, all those long nights, while their mother slept. Thomas went to bed. He slept, surprisingly, very well.
The morning of the reckoning, before he walked into that law office, Thomas did something I think about a lot. He went somewhere first. Somewhere quiet. Let me tell you where. On the morning of the meeting, before he drove downtown, Thomas went to the cemetery. It was cold, the grass stiff with frost, and he was the only living person among the rows of stones.
He walked to the place where his parents lay side by side, Walter and Eleanor Brennan, and he stood there for a while with his hands in his coat pockets, his breath fogging in the gray air. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. "Hi, Dad." He didn't say much. He had never been a man of many words, even alone, even here.
Only my mother told me you could watch on the live stream from your car. Understood, I replied and walked away. 2 days later, my mother called me screaming because of 30, but he wanted to come before it all happened, to stand in front of the two people that made him, and to be honest, at least one away and for the way he wanted. Not revenge, I really tried. His voice coat.
But I won't lie to you, even now. There's a part of me that's angry. A part that wants him to feel small, the way he made me feel small, the way he made you feel like a fool with those pretty fake statements. I'm not proud of that part. But it's in me. You always said the books record everything. So I figure you'd want an honest entry, not a flattering one. The wind moved through the bare trees.
He forged your name, Mom, Thomas said. Your name. The one you signed for 60 years. He sat down and traced it like it was nothing, like you were nothing, just an obstacle between him and a house. He shook his head slowly. I think that's the thing I can't forgive. Not what he did to me. What he did to your name. He stood a while longer. I'll look after Ethan, he said finally. I'll guard the trust.
I'll keep the house warm. I'll make the books balance the way you always said they would. He touched the top of the cold stone with one hand. I just wish balancing them didn't cost so much. I wish I could have had my brother and the truth both. But you can't, can you? That's the part nobody tells you. Sometimes you have to choose. He stayed until the cold got into his bones.
Then he straightened and squared his shoulders and walked back to his old car through the frosted grass. And he drove downtown, steady and unhurried, to keep a promise to a dead woman, and to balance a book that had been waiting 2 years to close. This is it. This is the day. I want you to walk into that law office with me, because what's about to happen in that conference room is the reason we're all here.
Grab your drink. Settle in. Let's go. The meeting was set for 2 o'clock at Diane Kessler's office, in a large conference room high above the city, with a long table and a wall of windows looking out at the gray autumn sky. Ryan arrived 10 minutes late, the way important men do.
He wore a perfect suit and an expensive watch and the confident half-smile of a man who has already won and is just here for the formalities. His attorney came with him, a slick, aggressive lawyer named Coleman who specialized in making problems disappear. Sloane was there too, sitting apart, quiet behind her sunglasses, and Ryan barely glanced at her, never imagining she was anything but scenery.
Several family members had come, invited as interested parties to the estate. The aunt who had weekly protested at the memorial. 2 cousins. An uncle. They sat along one side of the table, uncomfortable, not quite sure why they'd been asked, feeling the strange tension in the room. Thomas sat at the far end, in his same dark suit, with Diane Kessler beside him.
He looked, as he always looked, like the least important person in the room. Ryan settled into his chair and smiled around the table. All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I know this is hard. Let's try to do this quickly and respectfully, the way Mom would have wanted. He nodded toward Diane. I understand my brother has some kind of objection to Mom's will. So let's hear it, and then we can all move on.
Diane Kessler did not smile back. Thank you, Mr. Brennan, she said. Before we begin, I'd like to establish which document we're actually discussing. You filed a will with the probate court dated and signed, you claim, by your mother, Eleanor Brennan, leaving the family home to you. That's right, Mom's will. Simple as that. And you stand by that document. Its authenticity, its signature.
Of course I do. A flicker of impatience. It's Mom's will, Diane. I don't know what my brothers told you, but I ask, Diane said, because we are also holding a will. Signed by Eleanor Brennan in this office. Witnessed by 2 members of my staff, both present today. Notarized. Dated after the document you filed. She let that sit. And the 2 documents say very different things. The room went still. For the first time, the confident half-smile on Ryan's face wavered. No. That's not possible. Mom didn't make another will. She would have told me. She made it, Diane said calmly, precisely because she did not want to tell you. Ryan's lawyer, Coleman, leaned in. We'll need to examine any such document. Its provenance, of course, Diane said. And we'll need to examine yours.
Which is why I've asked a forensic document examiner to join us today. She nodded toward the door, and Dr. Sandra Pierce came in, carrying a slim folder and a pair of reading glasses, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. What followed was quiet, clinical, and utterly devastating. Dr. Pierce laid the documents out on the long table where everyone could see.
Eleanor's genuine signatures, gathered from decades of checks and letters and a real will, and Ryan's filed document beside them. She explained it the way she had explained it to Thomas. The pressure of a real signature, light and flowing, 60 years of muscle memory.
The tremor and hesitation of a forgery, the places where the pen had pressed too hard, the tiny stops and starts where a hand had been concentrating, drawing a shape instead of signing a name. In my professional opinion, Dr. Pierce said, the signature on the document Mr. Brennan filed with the court is not genuine. It was not made by Eleanor Brennan. It is a simulation.
You can live stream from your car and she wait 2 days later. Mom wait 2 days later. My mother called me screaming because it's a 30 or 40 produced by those Senator and cover. So that's the silent testimony of her glasses. I have to turned toward Ryan Brennan and his cousins, his uncle.
The family that had watched him stand up at his mother's memorial and throw his brother out of her house. They looked at him now, and you could see it moving across their faces, the slow, horrified understanding of what they were being told. Ryan had forged his own mother's signature to steal her house from the brother who had cared for her while she died.
This is insane, Ryan said, and his voice had lost its smoothness. This is, Tom, what is this? You put her up to this? You and some hired expert? You're going to stand there and accuse me of, I haven't said anything, Ryan, Thomas said quietly, from the end of the table. It was the first time he had spoken. I've just been listening. The way I listened to it my whole life. And here it comes. The second door.
Because exposing the forged will, that was just the first tier. That was for the family. What happens next is for everyone Ryan ever stole from. Stay with me, this is the moment. Ryan was on his feet now, his face red, the charm curdling into something uglier. You want the house that bad, Tom? Is that it? After everything I offered you? Fine. Take the house. Take the stupid house. I don't need it.
You think I need a falling down house on Hawthorne Lane? He was almost shouting now. I built an empire while you played nursemaid. I have more money than this whole family has seen in 3 generations. So take the house and choke on it. Sit down, Ryan. Coleman, his own lawyer, said quietly. He had gone pale. A good lawyer can smell when a room has turned, and this room had turned all the way around.
But Ryan didn't sit down. He couldn't. Men like Ryan, when they feel the ground shifting, they get louder, because volume is the only tool they've ever needed. You've always been jealous of me. My whole life. The boring older brother, watching me win. Well, you got your little moment, Tom. Congratulations. Enjoy the house. It was at that moment that the conference room door opened again. 2 people came in.
A man and a woman, in plain dark suits, with the calm, unhurried bearing of people who do not need to raise their voices because the law is already standing behind them. Agent Marsh, and his partner. Ryan stopped mid-sentence. Ryan Brennan? Agent Marsh said. Who are you? Marsh showed his credentials. He said the name of the federal agency.
He said it quietly, but in that silent room, every word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Mr. Brennan, we have a warrant for your arrest in connection with securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering related to the operation of Meridian Holdings and the Meridian Family Income Fund. He continued, steady and unhurried, the words turning Ryan's entire life into a single point in time.
I'll also inform you that as of this morning, the assets of Meridian Holdings and its associated entities have been frozen pursuant to a federal court order. The color drained from Ryan's face entirely. No, that's a mistake, that's a legitimate fund, you can't, I have clients, we've spoken with your clients, Mr. Brennan, Marsh said. We've spoken with your chief financial officer, Mr.
Doyle at length. He's been very helpful. A pause. We've spoken with your wife. Ryan turned and looked at Sloane. Sloane took off her sunglasses, finally, and looked back at her husband with an expression that held no surprise at all. Only a tired, cold finality. She had known this day was coming. She had helped it come. Sloane, Ryan said, and for the first time his voice was small. Sloane, what did you do?
I protected our son, she said simply. Which is more than I can say for you. And just like that, in front of his whole family, in front of the aunt and the cousins and the uncle, in front of the brother he had humiliated, Ryan Brennan's empire and his marriage and his freedom collapsed in the same single afternoon. The fund was a fraud. The agents laid out enough of it, right there, to make it undeniable.
The two smooth statements. The shell companies. The money taken from neighbors and family friends and from his own mother, on her deathbed, to fund the suits and the cars and the watch on his wrist. His aunt began to cry. Not for Ryan. For Eleanor. She gave you her savings, the old woman said. She trusted you. Your own mother. And the Hendersons, a cousin said, dawning horror in his voice.
My God, Ryan, the Hendersons put their retirement in your fund. They told me last Christmas. They were so proud of you. The old uncle at the end of the table, a man who had said almost nothing the entire meeting, spoke then, and his voice shook with something between grief and fury. I sent you my friends, Ryan. Men I served with. I told them, my nephew, he's the real thing, he'll take care of you.
I vouch for you with my own name. He had to stop and steady himself. What did you do with their money, son? What did you do? For one moment, one single moment, the mask came all the way off, and the family saw what was underneath. Not a businessman. Not a charming success.
Just a frightened, cornered man who had spent so long performing as a person he wasn't that there was almost nothing real left underneath the performance. The tan and the watch and the smile, and beneath it, a hollow place where a brother and a son and a man should have been. You don't understand, Ryan said, his voice going high and desperate. It was going to work. It was all going to work.
Only my mother told them loves to my call and the life story dares a reply and walked away 2 days later. My mother called me screaming because the 30 more time if I made no hold about it, but lost and you don't understand how close I was. Just a few more quarters, just a little more new money. They always believe.
Right up until the morning they wake up and there's nobody left to pay. The family stared at Ryan, and one by one, Thomas watched the last of their illusions about his brother die in their eyes. These were the people who had loved Ryan, who had bragged about his success, and who, just 3 weeks earlier, had sat in the Brennan living room feeling vaguely that Thomas was being difficult by objecting to the will.
Now, they finally understood. They saw the whole ugly shape of it. The charming one had been the thief all along, and the difficult one had been the only honest man left standing. Ryan had no answer. There was no charming way out of this trap. The numbers had finally caught up to him, the numbers his quiet brother had followed, patiently, in the lamplight, while their mother slept.
And numbers, unlike people, cannot be charmed. The agents read him his rights. They placed the handcuffs on him, there in the conference room, with the gray autumn sky filling the windows behind him. As they led him toward the door, Ryan stopped, turned, and looked down the long table at his brother. Thomas had not moved.
He sat exactly where he had been the whole time. Quiet, steady, his hands folded on the table in front of him. The two brothers looked at each other. "You did this," Ryan said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," Thomas said softly. "You did this, Ryan. I just kept the books. Now, you didn't think a man like Ryan would go down without throwing a punch, did you?"
Cornered men get desperate, and desperate men with money hire lawyers who will say anything. So before we get to the collapse, let me tell you about the last move Ryan tried, and how it blew up in his face one final time. Ryan did not go quietly. Men like Ryan rarely do. Out on bond, facing the end of everything, he poured what he could still reach into his defense.
His lawyer, Coleman, was aggressive and clever, and he understood that when the facts are against you, you attack the person bringing them. So Coleman built a story, and the story was about Thomas. The story went like this. Thomas was the bitter older brother. The jealous failure who had spent his whole life resenting Ryan's success.
The real will was a fabrication, cooked up by Thomas and a lawyer he'd hired to steal the estate from its rightful heir. The fraud allegations were the revenge of an envious man, dressed up in the language of an accountant. Poor Ryan Brennan, a successful businessman, brought down by his own jealous brother's elaborate scheme. It was a good story. Coleman knew how to tell it.
And for a little while, in certain corners, it almost found an audience. The trouble was that it had to survive contact with the evidence. And the evidence did not cooperate. The real will was the first thing to break the story. It had been signed in Diane Kessler's office, witnessed by two members of her staff who had no connection to Thomas and nothing to gain. It was notarized.
The neighbor who had driven Eleanor downtown to sign it testified that she had taken the old woman herself, at Eleanor's own request, and that Thomas had not even been present. You cannot claim a will is a forgery when the dying woman who signed it was driven to the lawyer by a neighbor while the supposed schemer was home changing her dressings. And then there was Dr.
Pierce, the document examiner, who took the question apart with the patience of a surgeon. The defense tried to suggest that perhaps both wills were questionable, that handwriting analysis was subjective, that nothing was certain. Dr. Pierce, who had testified in over 400 cases, did not flinch. She walked the court through the pressure patterns and the tremors and the muscle memory, and she made it so clear that a child could see it. One signature flowed. The other was drawn. One was a woman signing her own name for the 60,000th time. The other was a forger, concentrating. But the move that ended Coleman's story for good was the financial case, and here Ryan had made a fatal mistake.
He had attacked Thomas's credibility. He had called him a bitter, jealous failure. And so the prosecution simply established, for the record, what Thomas Brennan actually did for a living. For 30 years, Thomas had been one of the most respected forensic accountants in the region. He had testified for the government in major fraud trials. He had unwound schemes far larger than Ryan's.
Federal investigators called him when money went missing. Far from being a bitter failure, Thomas Brennan was precisely the kind of expert that prosecutors prayed they could get on the stand. The jealous failure story did not just fail.
It collapsed in spectacular fashion, because the man Coleman had painted as a resentful nobody turned out to be the single most qualified person in the entire case to explain exactly how Ryan had stolen the money. Every time the defense attacked Thomas's credibility, the prosecution simply read another line of his credentials. By the end, Coleman had stopped mentioning Thomas at all.
Coldly watched it apart, understood him cry. 2 days later, my mother called me screaming because the third the harder Ryan fought, the worse it got for him. The court did not, the worse it got for him, then smeared the brother cut and amended 4 judges and thus client to the only thing hold deaths do.
To stop fighting, and to plead, and to hope for mercy that, given everything, was not going to come in any great measure. Ryan Brennan had spent his whole life believing that the right words, said the right way, could get him out of anything. He learned, at the very end, that there are no words that talk you out of a balanced book. So the empire's gone. The marriage is gone. The freedom is gone.
But you know how these things go, friends. A fall like this doesn't stop at the bottom. It keeps going. Let me tell you what the next few months looked like for Ryan Brennan. The collapse, once it started, was total, the way these things always are when the only thing holding them up was the appearance of success. Meridian Holdings was finished within days.
The frozen accounts meant no new money could come in, and a Ponzi scheme without new money is just a hole in the ground that everyone falls into at once. The truth came out in the papers, in the same regional business paper that had sent a reporter to the Memorial weeks earlier. The headline was not the warm profile Ryan had imagined. It used words like fraud and betrayal, and the families he ruined.
The reporter who wrote it was the same one who had stood in the Brennan living room at the memorial, camera in hand, and watched Ryan throw his brother out of their dead mother's house. She had come that day expecting to write a flattering little piece about a prominent local businessman honoring his late mother. She had left with a strange, uneasy feeling she couldn't name, and she had kept the footage.
When the case broke, she went back to that footage, and she watched it again with new eyes. Ryan, smooth and smiling, reading a will the world now knew was forged. Ryan, telling his brother to be out by the end of the month. And Thomas, in his too tight suit, absorbing the cruelty without a word and walking quietly out the back door. She built her story around that moment. She tracked down the Hendersons and Mrs.
Calloway, and the other families. She told the whole arc of it. The charming son who stole from the neighborhood that raised him. The dying mother who saw the truth and quietly protected her family. And the overlooked older brother, the forensic accountant nobody in the family had ever really understood, who had spent 2 years in the lamplight building the case that brought it all down.
The story went wider than anyone expected. People who had never met the Brennans read it and saw, in it, something they recognized. The flashy one who took. The quiet one who held. The way the world so often gets those two confused, right up until the moment it can't anymore. The reporter asked Thomas for an interview. He declined, politely. He had no interest in being a story.
But he agreed to one question, in writing, and her final piece ended with it. She asked him whether, after a lifetime of being overlooked, it felt good to finally be seen. Thomas wrote back a single line. I didn't do it to be seen. I did it so the people he robbed could be made whole. If being seen is what comes of that, then I hope people see the right thing. Not me. Them. And there were families.
That was the part that haunted Thomas, even in the middle of everything else. The Hendersons, who had babysat the Brennan boys 40 years ago, had put their entire retirement into Ryan's fund. Mrs. Calloway down the street, the widow who brought a casserole to every funeral the family ever had given him her late husband's life insurance.
Dozens of people, many of them from the old neighborhood, people who trusted the Brennan name, had handed their savings to the charming boy they'd watched grow up. Most of that money was gone. Spent. That is the cruelest arithmetic of a fraud like Ryan's. By the time it's exposed, the money has already been burned, on suits and cars and a performance of a wealth that was never real.
But here is where Thomas's 2 years of patient work mattered most, in a way that had nothing to do with revenge. Because Thomas had traced the money so completely, because he had mapped every shell company and every hidden account, the federal team was able to recover far more than they usually could in a case like this. The frozen assets. The house Ryan and Sloane lived in. The cars.
Accounts Ryan thought were hidden, that Thomas had found in the lamplight. It would not make everyone whole. It never does. But it meant that the Hendersons would not spend their final years in poverty. It meant Mrs. Calloway would keep her home.
It meant the victims got something back, something real, because one quiet man had refused to look away and had done the hard, patient, unglamorous work of following the money to the very end. That, Thomas would think later, was the part that actually mattered. Not the handcuffs. Not the look on Ryan's face. The Hendersons kept their retirement. That was the entry in the ledger that counted.
Sloane filed for divorce while Ryan sat in a holding cell. Her own assets, the ones she quietly moved out of reach, were clean and untouchable, and her cooperation with the investigation had protected her completely. She took Ethan and moved to a smaller, honest life in another state. She was not a warm woman, and Thomas never grew close to her. But he respected what she had done.
Only my mother told me coldly you'd watch it on the live stream. Days later, replied and walked away. 2 days later, my mother called me from 30. She had seen the truth, kept her own quiet records, and protected her child, her own cold way. She was her Kevin on her sweaterhouse, and Thomas found he couldn't begrudge the man.
Doyle had been another person Ryan used and discarded, another set of hands doing the dirty work in the dark. The difference between Doyle and Thomas was simply which brother they'd been born to. And Ryan Brennan, the bright one, the charming one, the one who was always going somewhere, pleaded guilty in the end, because the case his brother built left him nowhere else to go.
There was no talking his way out of numbers. He was sentenced to years in federal prison. The watch was gone. The suits were gone. The empire was gone. The name he had spent his life building meant, now, only ruin. He had taken and taken and taken, certain that the people around him were too small to matter. And the books were balanced. There's one conversation from those months that I keep coming back to.
Because Thomas wasn't the only person Ryan had underestimated for years. And when these two finally talked honestly, it said something true about the whole story. Listen. Before Sloane left the state for good, she came to see Thomas once. He hadn't expected it. They had never been close. For years he dismissed her as part of Ryan's scenery, the woman in the sunglasses who didn't ask questions.
He had been wrong about her, the way he'd spent his life being wrong about exactly no one except, it turned out, the people closest to him. She sat in his living room, Ethan waiting in the car outside, and she was direct in a way Thomas respected. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for the trust, for protecting Ethan's piece of it. He's a good kid, Thomas. He's nothing like his father."
"I've spent his whole life making sure of that." "I know he is," Thomas said. "I can see it." Sloane was quiet for a moment. "You and I are more alike than you'd think," she said. "We both spent years watching that man take everything and tell himself he'd earned it. We both kept our own records. We both waited." A thin, humorless smile. "Everybody thought I married Ryan for the money."
The truth is, by the time I understood what he really was, I was already pregnant, and then it became about getting my son out of that house with his soul intact. So I waited. I documented. I got ready. And when the day came, I was ready. "You protected your boy," Thomas said. "That's not a small thing. That's the only thing, really." "They never see us coming, do they?" Sloane said. "The quiet ones."
The ones standing off to the side. They're so busy admiring themselves in the mirror, they never notice who's actually watching. She stood to go. "He underestimated you your whole life. He underestimated me for 20 years. I almost feel sorry for him. Almost." "I do feel sorry for him," Thomas said quietly. "That's the part that doesn't go away."
Sloane looked at him for a long moment, and something in her cold composure softened, just slightly. "Yeah," she said. "Me too, somewhere. He wasn't always like this. That's what makes it so sad." She put her sunglasses back on, the old armor sliding into place. "Take care of yourself, Thomas. And thank you for being the one who finally stood up. The rest of us were too tired, or too scared, or too tangled up in it."
You did the thing none of us could. And she left and drove away with her son toward a cleaner, smaller, honest life, and Thomas stood at the window and watched the car disappear down the street. Two holders who had each, in their own quiet way, outlasted the man who never once imagined they could. Now, you might think the story ends with the cell door closing. But it doesn't.
Because before all that, there was one more visit. One more night. And it's the part of the story that turns it from a tale about winning into something a lot harder, and a lot truer. Let's go there. Between the arrest and the sentencing, while Ryan was out on bond and the world was collapsing around him, he came to Thomas's house one night. It was raining, a cold steady rain. Thomas heard the knock, and when he opened the door, his brother was standing there, and the sight of him stopped Thomas cold. Ryan looked nothing like the man from the conference room, or the memorial, or the family gatherings. The tan was gone. The confidence was gone. The expensive suit had been replaced by a wrinkled jacket. He had lost weight. His eyes were red.
He looked, standing there in the rain, like a man who had aged 10 years in 3 months, which in a sense he had. "Tom," he said. His voice shook. "Can I come in?" Thomas looked at his brother for a long moment. Then he stepped back and let him in. They sat in Thomas's small, plain living room, the rain running down the windows. For a while, neither of them spoke. "I'm going to prison," Ryan said finally. "Years."
My lawyer says there's no way around it. The case is... He laughed, a broken sound. The case is airtight. That's the word he used. Airtight. He looked up at his brother. "You built an airtight case against me, Tom. Your own brother." "Yes," Thomas said. He did not look away. "I did." "Why?" The word came out raw. "I offered you the house. I offered you money. You could have just taken it and walked away."
Why did you have to burn it all down? Thomas was quiet for a moment, gathering the answer he had carried for 2 years. "Because of the Hendersons," he said. "Because of Mrs. Calloway. Because of Mom." His voice was steady and low. "You didn't just hurt me, Ryan. I could have lived with you hurting me. I've been living with it my whole life. But you stole from people who loved us."
Cold cheek on the letter, should I replied and walked away. 2 days later, my mother called. 2 days later, my mother comes through, and you stole from a dying, even young woman, still even as a jot in time, called. "You're a beautiful boy." Thomas dropped to the spread of wool to put his face in his hands.
And then, the way Thomas had somehow known he would, the way these men always do when they finally reach the bottom, Ryan reached for one last thing. "The trust," Ryan said, his voice muffled. "Mom's trust. For Ethan. You're the trustee. There's money in there they can't touch. If you released some of it, just enough for my legal defense, I could fight this, I could, and there it was. Even now."
Even at the very bottom, sitting in his brother's living room having ruined dozens of lives, Ryan Brennan had come not to apologize, but to find one more thing to take. He wanted to drain his own son's future to save himself. Thomas stood up. "That trust is for Ethan," he said quietly. "It's the one thing in this entire mess that's still clean."
It's the last gift your mother made, and she made it to protect your son from exactly the kind of man you turned into. You will not touch it. Not $1. Not ever. I'll guard it with everything I have, because I made her a promise, and unlike you, I keep mine. Ryan looked up at him and his face crumpled.
And then Ryan Brennan, the bright one, the charming one, the one who was always going somewhere, slid off the chair and onto his knees on his brother's living room floor, and he began to sob. He gripped the edge of the coffee table. He said Thomas's name over and over. He begged. And Thomas, looking down at him, waited for the thing he had once, in his angriest moments, imagined he would feel. The triumph.
The vindication. The hot, bright satisfaction of watching the golden brother brought low at last. It did not come. There was no triumph. There was only the old grief, and underneath it, something that felt almost unbearable. Because Thomas did not see, kneeling on his floor, the man who had humiliated him at their mother's memorial.
He saw a 4-year-old boy on a bicycle, turning around to shout, "Tommy, look, I'm doing it." He saw the brother he had taught to ride, the brother he had loved before the world taught them both their roles. He saw everything that boy could have been, and everything he threw away, and the grief of it was so large that Thomas had to hold the back of a chair to stay standing. "Get up, Ryan," Thomas said gently.
Get up off the floor. But Ryan stayed down, sobbing, and Thomas could not make him rise, and after a while Thomas simply sat back down in his chair and waited, the way he had waited his whole life, while his brother wept on the floor and the cold rain ran down the windows. Hey, it's Ray. So Thomas won. He got the house. He kept his promise. The bad guy's going to prison, the victims got something back.
By every measure, he won completely. So why does this next part ache the way it does? Stay with me for the ending. I think it's the most important part. The house on Hawthorne Lane came to Thomas, the way his mother had wanted, the way the real Will had always said. He moved back into it in the spring. He had thought, in the early days, that moving back would feel like a victory.
He had pictured it sometimes during the long nights of the investigation, the moment he would walk back through the front door of the house his brother had tried to throw him out of. He had imagined it would feel like setting down a weight. It did not feel like that. It felt like walking into a museum of everything he had lost. His mother was everywhere in that house, and so, somehow, was his brother.
Here was the kitchen where Eleanor had kept her black ledgers and licked her pencil and said the books always balance. Here was the back bedroom where she had died, holding his hand. Here was the front yard, and the maple tree his father planted, where 2 boys had once learned to ride a bicycle, one running behind the other with his hand on the seat.
Thomas walked through the empty rooms in the evening, and the silence was enormous. He had won. He had everything. The house, the truth, his mother's final wishes fulfilled, the victims made as whole as they could be, his own name finally, quietly, understood by the family that had overlooked him for 50 years. They saw him now. The aunt who had watched him walk out of the memorial called him weakly.
The cousins treated him with a new and careful respect. The quiet one. The steady one. The one who, it turned out, had been the strongest in the family all along. And none of it filled the silence in the house. Because here is the truth that Thomas carried, the truth this whole long story comes down to. Winning did not give him back his brother. It did not give back the boy on the bicycle.
It did not give back the family they might have been, in another life, if the world hadn't handed them their roles. If Ryan had ever once learned that taking is not the same as having. It did not give back his mother, who he would have traded the whole estate, the house and the trust, and every dollar, to sit with for one more hour by the lamp. This is the part the satisfying stories don't usually tell you.
That even perfect justice has a hollow center. That you can be completely, undeniably right, you can balance every column in the ledger, and still find yourself standing alone in a house full of ghosts, mourning not your enemy, but your brother. The same person. The cruelest arithmetic of all. Thomas did not hate Ryan. He had thought he would, by the end.
Closed the unleft reading him from her understood. I replied and walked away. 2 days later, my mother called me screaming because of 30. He found and said that he simply grieved him the way you grieve someone who died long ago. Someone brave other you loved had died long its own life. They stayed across the scratch table in a grey room.
Ryan was thinner, quieter, stripped of everything that had made him Ryan. And for the first time in their lives, with nothing left to perform, Ryan was almost honest. I don't know when it happened, Ryan said, staring at his hands. When I became the guy who could do that. To Mom. To the Hendersons. I keep trying to find the day. There isn't one.
It was 1,000 little choices, and every one of them felt small, and then one day I looked up and I was a monster and I hadn't even noticed becoming one. He looked up at Thomas. You never wanted anything. Your whole life. How? How did you never want anything? I wanted plenty, Thomas said quietly. I just learned a long time ago that wanting and taking aren't the same thing. Dad taught me that.
You weren't listening, I think. You were always somewhere louder. Ryan almost smiled. Yeah, I was. They sat in silence for a moment, two old men now or nearly, in a gray room that smelled of disinfectant and despair. Do you remember the paper bag? Thomas asked. Ryan looked up. What? When Dad lost the shift at the plant. You were 15. You came home and dumped $42 on the kitchen table.
You'd lied your way into a weekend job so Mom would stop crying through the wall at night. Thomas's voice was very gentle. You did that, Ryan. That was you. A kid who couldn't stand to hear his mother cry. So he went out and fixed it the only way he knew how. With his mouth. With his charm. That was the first time I saw what you could do. And it was the best thing I ever saw you do. Ryan's eyes filled.
He looked down at the scratched table. I keep trying to tell you, Thomas said. It wasn't the charm that ruined you. The charm was a gift. You used it to take care of us, back then. Somewhere along the way you turned it around and started using it on us instead of for us. That's all. That's the whole story of how a good boy becomes what you became.
You took the one thing that was beautiful about you and you pointed it the wrong way. I don't know how to fix it, Ryan whispered. Any of it. There's no fixing it. No, Thomas agreed. Some things don't get fixed. They just get recorded. He stood. But Ethan's going to be all right. I want you to know that, in here, on the nights it's bad.
Your son is going to grow up honest and steady and good, and he's going to know how to take care of the people he loves without ever once stealing from them. I'll see to it. That's the one thing I can still fix. So fix nothing else, Ryan. Just hold on to that. Ryan was crying openly now, the way Thomas had not seen him cry since they were children. When the visit ended, Thomas stood to go, and Ryan said his name.
Tom. Thank you. For Ethan. For the trust. For not letting me ruin his life the way I ruined everything else. His voice broke. And I'm sorry. I know it doesn't matter. But I am. For the memorial. For all of it. For our whole lives. Thomas stood there a moment. I know, he said. And he found that he meant it, and that it changed nothing, and that both of those things could be true at once. Goodbye, Ryan.
He did not visit again. He didn't need to. Some things, once you've said them, are said. We're almost at the end now. And I want to show you the last thing Thomas did, because it's small and it's quiet, and it tells you everything about the difference between the brother who took and the brother who stayed. Thomas did not sell the house. He thought about it. It held so much sorrow.
But it also held his whole family, every good memory along with the bad, and his mother had wanted him to have it, and he found in the end that he could not let it go. So he stayed. He fixed the things that had fallen into disrepair during the long years of his mother's illness. He repaired the back steps where the photograph had been taken. He pruned the maple tree. And he made the house into something it had never quite been allowed to be while it stood as a prize for Ryan to covet. He made it a home that gave instead of took. His daughter Hannah came more often now, with her own children, Thomas's grandchildren, and the empty rooms began, slowly, to fill with noise again. The kitchen where Eleanor had kept her ledger smelled of cooking once more.
On Sunday afternoons there were small feet running down the hallway where two boys had once run, and Thomas would stand in the kitchen doorway, where he had always stood, but it felt different now. He was not on the outside of the family anymore, looking in. He was its center. The one who held it. And there was Ethan. Ryan's son, 16 when it all happened, was nearly 18 now.
The boy had been shattered by what his father did, ashamed of the name he carried, lost in the wreckage. Sloane had taken him away to a new life, but the boy and his Uncle Thomas began, carefully, to write to each other, and then to call. And then, in the summers, Ethan came to stay at the house on Hawthorne Lane. Thomas taught him things: how to fix the back steps, how to prune the maple.
And when the boy was ready, how to read a ledger, how to follow the patient logic of numbers, how money tells a story if you're quiet enough to listen. Ethan, it turned out, had his uncle's mind, the careful, steady, honest mind, not his father's restless charm.
Only my mother told Lee you can watch it on the live stream from your car, understood her plan, walked till 2 days later. Mother called 2 days later. My mother called me screaming, and Thomas thought sometimes watching the bookman of her call and refused to let the rot spread to the next generation. It was not simple between it. It could never be simple.
Thomas was the man who had sent Ethan's father to prison. There were hard nights, especially early on, when the boy's grief curdled into anger and he flung the truth at his uncle like a stone. "You're the reason I don't have a dad." Thomas never argued, never defended himself, never said the thing he could have said, that Ethan's father was the reason Ethan didn't have a dad.
He simply absorbed it, the way he had absorbed everything his whole life, and waited, and stayed, and was still there in the morning, making breakfast, asking the boy if he wanted to help fix the gutter. And slowly, the way these things mend, Ethan came to understand. Not all at once.
But one quiet day, the summer he turned 18, the boy looked up from the ledger they were working through together and said, out of nowhere, "He'd have taken everything, wouldn't he? My dad. If you hadn't stopped him. He'd have taken my whole future and never even felt it." "Yes," Thomas said. He had promised himself he would never lie to the boy. He would have.
Ethan nodded slowly and looked back down at the numbers. "Thanks," he said very quietly, "for being the one who stopped him, even though it was him, and he never threw the stone again, that Thomas thought was worth more than the house and the whole estate together. A boy who would not become his father. A line in the ledger, finally, written in a steady hand. The books were still balancing. They always were.
It just took longer than you'd like." In the drawer of the kitchen table, the same drawer where Eleanor had kept her black ledgers all those years, Thomas kept two things. The first was his mother's final ledger, her real one, the household accounts she had kept until her hands grew too weak.
He kept it because it was hers, and because her small, careful handwriting was in it, and because sometimes, on the hard nights, he would open it and run his finger down a column of her entries and feel, for a moment, that she was near. The second was a single sheet of paper. A copy of the forged will. Ryan's forgery, the document that had started everything, with the traced signature that Dr.
Pierce had so quietly destroyed. He did not keep it out of hatred. He had let the hatred go, mostly, somewhere along the way. He kept it the way you keep a scar. As a record. As proof of what had happened, and what it had cost, and what people are capable of, even people you love, even people you taught to ride a bicycle.
Sometimes, late in the evening, Thomas would open the drawer and look at the two documents lying side by side. His mother's true ledger, full of small kindnesses recorded in a steady hand. And his brother's forged will, a single cruelty drawn in a trembling one. Every kindness is an entry. Every cruelty, too.
Then he would slide the drawer shut and go check on the grandchildren, and the house would be warm and full and his. So here we are, the very end. And I'll be honest with you, this is the part that stayed with me the longest. Because Thomas got everything. And he lost the one thing he couldn't get back. Let me leave you with this.
A year after Ryan went to prison, on a quiet autumn evening much like the one this story began on, Hannah asked her father a question. They were sitting at the kitchen table, the grandchildren finally asleep upstairs, 2 cups of tea between them. The maple tree was just beginning to turn outside the window. "Dad," Hannah said. "Do you ever regret it? Going after Uncle Ryan the way you did? Building the whole case?"
I know it had to be done, but he's your brother. Do you ever wish you'd just taken the money and walked away? Thomas considered the question for a long time, the way he considered everything. "If I'd taken the money and walked away," he said finally, "the Hendersons would have lost their retirement. Mrs. Calloway would have lost her home."
Dozens of people who trusted this family would have been ruined, and your Uncle Ryan would have kept going until it all collapsed on its own, and then he'd have flown off somewhere and left them all in the wreckage. He wrapped his hands around his tea. "So no. I don't regret stopping him. I'd do it again. I'd do it 100 times. But," Hannah said. She knew her father. She heard the thing underneath.
"But," Thomas said quietly, "I'll tell you what I regret. I regret that the world ever taught us our roles. That somewhere along the way, your uncle learned that the only way to matter was to take, and to shine, and to be the loudest one in the room. And I learned to disappear. To be the one who stays, and gives, and asks for nothing, and gets overlooked." He looked at his daughter. "We were both lied to, Hannah."
He just believed a worse lie than I did. And it cost everyone everything. Hannah reached across the table and took his hand. "You were never overlooked, Dad," she said. "Not by the people who actually mattered. Grandma knew. She left you the house. She left you the trust. She left you Ethan. She knew exactly who you were the whole time." Thomas's eyes were wet. "She did, didn't she?" he said.
Coldly, you can watch on the live stream from your car. Dr. replied and walked away. Waved 2 days later. My mother called me stream because the 30 year sooner. So wish I'd always running to third time they've even. But think that then is what has been about. The thing Thomas understood now and never had before.
There are 2 kinds of people in this world. There are the ones who shine, who take, who stand in the center of the room and demand that everyone watch. And there are the ones who hold, who stay, who do the quiet, unglamorous, unwatched work of keeping everything from falling apart. The world celebrates the first kind. It hands them the attention and the glory and the benefit of every doubt.
And it overlooks the second kind, takes them for granted, lets them stand in the kitchen doorway year after year, until the day, God forbid, that they stop holding, and everyone finds out all at once exactly what they've been carrying. Thomas Brennan had been a holder his whole life. He had been overlooked, and underestimated, and used, and finally humiliated at his own mother's memorial.
And when the moment came when his family needed someone to see the truth that no one else could see, it was the overlooked one, the quiet one, the one who stayed, who stood up at his full height at last and balanced every book. He won. Completely.
And it cost him his brother, and it could not give him back his mother, and he would carry the weight of both of those things for the rest of his life, in the warm and crowded and haunted house on Hawthorne Lane. That was the truth the books told in the end. Justice and grief side by side. A kindness and a cruelty in the same drawer. The columns had added up. They always do. It just takes longer than you'd like.
And that's the story. Blood money. The brother they all wrote off as the failure, the quiet one, the bookkeeper who turned out to be the only one strong enough to stop the man everyone admired. I hope you stuck with me all the way to the end, because to me, this was never really a story about revenge. It was a story about the people we overlook. The ones who stay.
The ones who hold it all together while someone else takes the credit and the spotlight. So here's what I want you to do tonight. Think about the quiet, steady, loyal person in your own life. The one who never asks for anything. The one who's always just there, holding things up. And go tell them you see them. Tell them tonight. Before anyone has to learn the hard way what they were really worth. Thank you for watching. I'm Ray. Take care of each other. And I'll see you in the next one.